The ships came on a Tuesday morning. They filled the sky from horizon to horizon, blocking out the sun and casting the whole world into shadow. People stopped in the streets and looked up. They held their phones and took pictures. They called their families. Some prayed. Some cried. Most just stood there, unable to understand what they were seeing. The Vethrani Dominion had crossed the stars for 10,000 years. They had conquered 1,000 different species on 1,000 different worlds. Not once had they failed. Not once had a species resisted for more than a single generation. They were patient. They were thorough. And they had turned the breaking of civilizations into a science. Earth fell in 6 months. The militaries of the world fought back, of course. They launched their missiles and flew their jets and fired their guns. But the Vethrani had shields that stopped everything humans could throw at them. They had weapons that could level a city block with a single shot. They did not negotiate. They did not make demands. They simply landed, and they took dot by the end of the first year. The world had been reorganized. Cities became labor districts. Factories were rebuilt to produce goods for the Dominion. Every human over the age of 12 was fitted with a neural compliance collar, a thin band of metal that wrapped around the neck and connected directly to the brain. The collar could not be removed. It monitored thoughts, and when it detected defiance, it delivered pain. The more defiant the thought, the greater the pain. The Vethrani governors settled into their administrative towers and began their reports. Earth was classified as a successful acquisition. The native species was cataloged as herd social obligates, creatures who followed leaders and fell apart without them. Standard procedure was applied. Politicians were executed. Generals were executed. Religious figures, artists, scientists, anyone who might inspire resistance, all executed in public broadcasts that every human was forced to watch. The Vethrani expected what always came next. Grief, then acceptance, then compliance. A generation of sorrow, followed by generations of quiet servitude. It had worked 1,000 times before, but something different happened on Earth. In the labor camps, humans began to talk. Not about revolution, not about fighting back. They talked about each other. They shared stories of small acts of courage that the Vethrani had never noticed. A teacher named Amara, who had hidden 30 children in a basement during the initial invasion, keeping them safe for 3 days until the fighting moved on. A factory worker named Chen, who had quietly switched the labels on a weapon shipment, sending plasma rifles to a recycling facility instead of the front lines. A grandmother named Esperanza, who sang old songs to her grandchildren every night, even though the collar made her scream with pain every time she did it. These stories spread from person to person, whispered in the work lines, shared in the sleeping quarters, passed between strangers who would never meet again. The Vethrani monitored communications, but they were looking for plans. They were looking for conspiracy. They did not understand what the humans were actually doing. They were building something that could not be seen or measured. They were building hope. Overseer Tethfun was the first to notice that something was wrong. His district had the lowest productivity in the sector, and he could not figure out why. The humans worked. They followed orders. They did not openly resist. But everything took longer than it should. Machines broke down in ways that should have been impossible. Supply reports contained errors that cascaded into bigger problems. And no matter how many times he increased the punishment settings on the collars, nothing improved. He filed a report with High Command, requesting guidance. The response was simple: increase the pain. Make examples. Fear was the only language that primitives understood. So Tethfon made examples. He selected workers at random and had them tortured in front of the others. He executed a man for looking at him wrong. He doubled the work hours and halved the food rations. The collars delivered punishment for the smallest infractions, until humans were falling unconscious from the pain several times a day. And still, the productivity did not improve. What Teflon did not understand, what none of the Vethrani understood, was that humans had a relationship with suffering that no other species shared. For most creatures, pain was simply pain. It was something to avoid. It was a signal that something was wrong, and the correct response was to stop whatever caused it. But humans had spent their entire history turning pain into something else. They had built religions around the idea that suffering had meaning. They had created art about the beauty found in sorrow. They told stories about heroes who endured the unendurable and came out stronger on the other side. The Vethrani thought they were teaching humans to fear. Instead, they were teaching humans that they could survive. In a labor camp outside of what had once been Lagos, a young woman named Yuki Okonko lay on her thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. The collar around her neck still ached from the day's punishments. She had been caught thinking about her mother, who had died in the invasion. The collar had made her pay for that memory. But as the pain faded, something else remained. A thought. A tiny spark of an idea that had been growing in the back of her mind for months now. The collars were machines, and machines could be broken. She closed her eyes and began to think carefully, in short bursts that stayed below the collar's detection threshold. She thought about frequencies, about feedback loops, about what might happen if thousands of collars tried to fire at exactly the same moment. She did not know it yet, but she had just started a revolution. 3 years into the occupation, the humans began to sing. It started in a factory in what had once been Poland. A woman on the assembly line began humming a melody, no words, just notes rising and falling in a pattern that her grandmother had taught her when she was small. The collar flickered but did not fire. The algorithms that controlled it were designed to detect language, to punish communication. But this was not language. This was something older. The woman next to her picked up the melody. Then the next. Within an hour, the entire factory floor was humming together, a wave of sound that rolled through the building like water. The Vethrani overseers watched with confusion. Their translation systems could not decode what was being said because nothing was being said. It was just sound, just noise. But it was not just noise. The melody carried emotion. It carried memory. It carried a message that did not need words. You are not alone. We are still here. We have not given up. The singing spread. Across oceans and continents, humans began to make music again. They tapped rhythms on their workstations. They whistled while they walked. They created new melodies that had never existed before, sounds that their children would one day call the songs of resistance. The Vethrani tried to stop it. They adjusted the collar algorithms. They punished anyone caught making unauthorized sounds. But music was older than language itself, wired into the human brain at a level the collars could not reach. And through the music, messages began to travel. Yuki Okonko had spent 2 years working on her theory. She could only think about it in short bursts, 3 minutes at a time. Never more, or the collar would detect sustained unauthorized cognition and punish her. But 3 minutes was enough. 3 minutes, repeated 1,000 times, added up to thousands of hours of careful, patient thought. She had figured out the weakness. The collars worked by monitoring neural activity and responding to patterns that matched defiance. But the system was not perfect. It had limits. If too many collars tried to fire at the same time, drawing power from the same grid, the system would overload. The collars would burn out. And for a few precious moments, the humans would be free to think whatever they wanted. The problem was coordination. How could she tell hundreds of thousands of people to think the same thought at the same moment, without the collars detecting the communication? The answer came to her while listening to a work crew sing. Music. A a specific melody, taught from person to person, spreading through the camps like a virus. A song with no words, just a pattern that built to a specific moment, a rest, a held breath. And in that pause, everyone who knew the song would think the same. Forbidden's thought at the same instant. It took 8 months for the song to spread. It moved through the labor camps and the factory floors and the sleeping quarters. It crossed borders without passports. It traveled through prisons and hospitals and the ruins of cities. The Vethrani heard it, of course. They heard it everywhere, but their systems could find nothing dangerous in it. It was just a melody, just humans making their strange noises again. On the anniversary of the invasion, the sun rose over the Western Administrative Zone, the region that had once been called Europe. In factories and fields and mines and construction sites, 300,000 humans stopped what they were doing. They did not speak. They did not signal to each other. They simply began to hum. The melody built slowly. Note by note, it grew, rising through the morning air. Vethrani overseers watched with irritation but not concern. It was just the singing again. The strange, pointless singing. The melody reached its peak. And then it paused. In that moment of silence, 300,000 humans thought the same thought. We are not defeated. The callers detected the defiance. All of them. At the same instant. They tried to fire, to deliver their punishment, to force the humans back into submission. But 300,000 callers drawing power at the same moment was too much. The grid could not handle it. Feedback loops cascaded through the system. The collars overheated. And then, one by one, they burned out. Across the Western Administrative Zone, humans felt the metal bands around their necks go dead. For the first time in 3 years, they could think without fear. They could feel without punishment. Some fell to their knees and wept. Some screamed in joy. Some simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by the sudden freedom inside their own minds. Thought it lasted only minutes. Vethrani troops arrived quickly, their weapons ready, their faces hard with fury. They rounded up anyone who had been part of the singing. They made new examples. They fitted new collars, better ones, with redundant systems and failsafes that could kill with a single command. The official report called it the Western malfunction. A technical failure. Nothing more. But everyone knew the truth. The humans had won a battle. Not with weapons. Not with violence. They had won with music and hope and a single shared thought. They had proven that the collars could be beaten. And if the collars could be beaten, then maybe, just maybe, the Vethrani could be beaten too. In a detention cell, waiting for execution, Yuki Okonkwo smiled. She had known she would not survive this. She had known from the beginning that the price of freedom was higher than any one person could pay. But she had also known something else, something the Vethrani would never understand. Ideas do not die with the people who have them. The song was still out there. The knowledge of what was possible was still spreading. And somewhere in a labor camp or a factory or a ruined city, another human was already thinking about the next step. The Vethrani had tried to crush the spark before it became a flame. They were already too late. The Vethrani responded to the Western malfunction with overwhelming force. They brought in new troops from off-world. They tripled the number of overseers. They replaced every burned-out collar with a new design, stronger, smarter, with a failsafe that would kill the wearer if tampering was detected. Public executions were broadcast across the planet. Anyone connected to the singing was hunted down and made an example of. High Command was satisfied. The rebellion had been crushed before it truly began. The humans would learn their place, just like every other species before them. But the Vethrani had made a mistake. They thought the collar overload was the rebellion. They thought destroying it meant destroying the resistance. They did not understand that the singing had never been about winning a battle. It had been about proving something was possible. And now, Every human on Earth knew that Vethrani technology could be beaten. In the years that followed, something strange began to happen. Small things at first. A water filtration system in a mining camp stopped working properly. When the Vethrani engineers examined it, they found nothing wrong. The machine was functioning exactly as designed. It simply was not producing clean water anymore. The engineers adjusted the settings and moved on. A month later, the same thing happened at another camp. Then another. Then a dozen more. The filtration systems were not breaking. They were changing, slowly, in ways too small to notice. Someone had figured out how to modify the filters to remove trace elements that Vethrani biology needed to survive. The water was still clean by human standards. It was just quietly poisonous to the occupiers. This was only the beginning. In a Bayard factory in what had once been Japan, a young man named Kenji worked on the assembly line for Vethrani communication arrays. He had been an electronics student before the invasion. Now he spent his days installing components exactly as the overseers demanded. But once a week, when the patrol cycled to another section, he made a tiny adjustment. A wire moved 1 millimeter to the left. A connection made slightly weaker than it should be. Nothing that would show up in quality testing. Nothing that would fail right away. The arrays worked perfectly when they left the factory. They worked perfectly for months afterward. And then, one by one, they began to develop blind spots. Tiny gaps in coverage that grew larger over time. The Vethrani noticed the gaps, of course. They sent repair crews. The crews found nothing wrong. The equipment was functioning exactly as designed. It simply was not working as well as it used to. No single act of sabotage was enough to matter. But humanity was not fighting with single acts. In food processing plants, workers learned which Earth bacteria grew best in Vethrani respiratory systems. They did not poison the air that would be detected. They simply made sure the ventilation filters were cleaned a little less thoroughly than they should be. Vethrani workers began to get sick. Not dangerously sick, just tired, just weak, just slightly less effective than they used to be. In transportation hubs, mechanics made small errors in maintenance. Landing struts that wore out faster than expected. Fuel systems that developed minor leaks. Navigation computers that drifted slightly off course. No single error was enough to cause a crash. But every error cost time and resources to fix. In administrative centers, human clerks made mistakes in paperwork. Supply orders went to the wrong locations. Personnel files were misfiled. Communication logs were accidentally deleted. The Vethrani had built an empire on bureaucracy, on the smooth flow of information from one office to another. Humans learned to make that flow just a little rougher, just a little slower. Just enough to matter. The Vethrani noticed that things were getting harder. They filed reports. They demanded investigations. They punished workers and replaced equipment and rewrote procedures. But they could not find a conspiracy because there was no conspiracy to find. There was no central leadership. No secret meetings. No coordinated plan. There were just millions of humans, each one doing their small part. Each one trusting that others were doing theirs. A scientist named Amara, the same teacher who had hidden children during the invasion, had survived the occupation by keeping her head down and her mouth shut. But she had not stopped thinking. She had studied the Vethrani. She had watched how they worked. And she had noticed something that none of the occupiers seemed to realize. The Vethrani had stopped inventing. Their technology was advanced, but it was also ancient. The same ships they use today were the same ships their ancestors had used 1,000 years ago. The same weapons, the same collars, the same administrative systems. They had found solutions that worked, and they had never looked for better ones. Humanity was different. Humans had gone from fire to nuclear power in the blink of an eye, compared to the Vethrani timeline. From stone tools to computers in a single breath of history, humans could not stop inventing. It was wired into their nature. Even when they were enslaved, even when they were crushed, even when thinking was punished with pain, the Vethrani had conquered a species that evolved through constant change. And that species was changing now, adapting, learning, growing stronger in ways the occupiers could not see and would not understand until it was too late. In her small room in the labor camp, Amara wrote notes in a code she had invented. She passed them to others, who passed them on, spreading knowledge like seeds in fertile soil. How to modify machines, how to confuse sensors, how to make the occupation just a little bit harder every single day. She knew she might not live to see freedom. Many would not. But that was not the point. The point was to keep fighting, one small cut at a time, until the enemy bled out. 12 years after the invasion, the Vethrani Dominion made an announcement. All personnel were to withdraw from Earth immediately. The planet was being reclassified as administratively non-viable. Official reports cited geological instability, atmospheric incompatibility, and resource depletion as the reasons for departure. None of that was true. The truth was simpler and more humiliating than the Dominion could ever admit. Earth had become too expensive to hold. The occupation was costing more than it produced. The Vethrani were losing, not in battle. There had been no great uprising, no army of freedom fighters storming the gates. The humans had never fired a shot that mattered. They had done something worse. They had made every single aspect of the occupation slightly harder than it should be. And over 12 years, those small difficulties had grown into an avalanche. Machinery failed constantly. Not in dramatic explosions, but in small malfunctions that needed repair. Then more repair. Then replacement. The supply lines that kept the occupation running were clogged with errors and delays. Vethrani workers were always sick, always tired, always needing medical attention for conditions their doctors could not explain. Administrative systems that had functioned perfectly for centuries suddenly developed problems that no one could solve. And through it all, the humans kept working. They followed orders. They wore their collars. They never openly rebelled. But their eyes told a different story. There was something in those eyes that made even veteran Vethrani soldiers uncomfortable. Not hatred. Not fear. Something else. Hope. Governor Rethkai, the highest-ranking Vethrani on Earth, filed his final report from his tower in what had once been Tokyo. He wrote about equipment failures and supply shortages and personnel losses. He wrote about costs and projections and administrative complications. But buried in the middle of his report, almost hidden, was a single observation that none of his superiors would understand. The humans have not been broken. They cannot be broken. Every measure we take to crush their spirit only seems to make it stronger. I recommend complete withdrawal before we lose more than we can afford. The evacuation took 3 months. Vethrani ships lifted off from landing pads all over the world, carrying soldiers and administrators and everything they could salvage from their failed conquest. They left behind the ruins of their occupation, the factories, the camps, the towers, the graves. They left behind the collars. On the day the last ship departed, humans gathered in places all over the world. No one had organized these gatherings. No one had called for them. People simply came together, as they always had, drawn by an instinct older than language. They stood in the rubble of their cities and looked up at the sky. They watched the Vethrani ships grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the darkness of space. And then, somewhere in the crowd, someone began to sing Dod. It was the melody from 12 years ago. The song that had spread through the labor camps. The song that had burned out the collars. People who had been children when they first heard it were grown now, and they remembered every note. The singing spread through the crowd. Then beyond, picked up by radios and speakers and voices across the world. For the first time since the invasion, humans sang together without fear of punishment. In the crowd in São Paulo, a woman named Yuki Okonkwo listened to the music. She was older now, her hair gray, her face lined with scars from years in the labor camps. The Vethrani had not executed her after the Western malfunction. They had tried, but there had been riots, actual riots. Humans fighting back with their bare hands, and in the chaos, she had escaped. She had spent the next decade in hiding, helping to coordinate the quiet war that had slowly bled the occupation dry. A journalist found her in the crowd. News organizations from a dozen countries were covering the liberation, hungry for heroes, for symbols, for someone to put on their screens. "Ambassador Okonkwo," the journalist said, "do you have a message for the Vethrani? For the Dominion?" Yuki looked at the sky. The last transport was just visible, a faint point of light climbing toward the stars. She thought about everything that had happened. The invasion, the collars, the pain and the fear and the long, hard years of resistance. She thought about everyone who had not lived to see this day. The teachers and workers and grandmothers who had kept hope alive, one small act at a time, until hope became something stronger than any weapon. "Tell them we remember," she said. "Tell them we learned. And tell them we are coming." The journalist blinked. "Coming? What do you mean?" Yuki smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a species that had been underestimated for the last time. "The Vethrani have been conquering worlds for 10,000 years, she said. "They have never failed. They have never faced a species they could not break. And now they have to live with the knowledge that we beat them. Not with armies, not with weapons. We beat them by being too stubborn to die." She turned back to the sky. "They are going to spend the rest of their existence wondering when we are going to return the favor. Every time they look up at the stars, they will remember what we taught them. And someday, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for 100 years, but someday, they will learn just how long humans can hold a grudge." The singing continued around her, a melody of defiance, a promise of what was to come. The Vethrani had tried to break humanity's spirit. They had used pain and fear and every tool that had worked on 1,000 other species. But humanity was different. Humanity did not break. It bent and twisted, and sometimes it fell. But it always got back up, and it never forgot. The stars were waiting, and humanity was just getting started.